Welcome to part 2 of this YSL tutorial on Excel VBA user forms. We're going to pick up right where we left off in the previous video and talk about how to run and navigate through your forms. So we'll start with a quick reminder of how to run a form within Visual Basic Editor as a developer, and then talk about how you can create a basic user interface for your users to run a form in a quick, easy, simple way. When the form's running, we'll look at how you can tab through controls and how you can control the tab order and whether a control should be tabbable in the first place. We'll also mention how you can assign accelerator keys to controls, so your users have a quick keyboard shortcut way to jump to a specific control. Finally, we'll talk about how you can set up default and cancel buttons on the form, which sets default actions for the enter key and the escape key on your keyboard. So let's get started. We're going to use the same form that we finished creating in the previous video, which was a basic data entry form for this simple list of films. To see it, we'll need to go back to the Visual Basic Editor, and as always you can either do that from the Developer tab, click the Visual Basic button, or press Alt and F11 on the keyboard. If the form isn't visible already, you can expand the Forms folder, and then just double click on the form object to open it up. When you want to run the form as a developer just to test what it looks like, you can do this just by selecting the form by clicking somewhere on its background or on one of its controls, and then choosing to either click the green triangle or press the F5 key on your keyboard. Do make sure that you've clicked on the actual form object, not the form as it sits in the Project Explorer. If you do it this way and choose to run the form, you'll be asked which macro you want to run, which is not much use. So make sure you've clicked on the form itself or one of its controls, then click the triangle or press the F5 key, and the form will load, and will be shown sitting on top of the Excel window. It'll set its startup position based on the startup position property of the form, which we'll talk about in just a moment. There's not much you can really do with the form at this point, unless you've added any code to it. You can click and drag to move it around, you can type into the text boxes, you can click on the buttons. Nothing will actually happen, of course, because we haven't added the code yet. So all we're going to do here is just close the form down to take us back to the VBE. We mentioned the startup position property in the previous video as a way to control exactly where on the screen your form appears. Just to remind you of that, I'm going to go to the categorized view of my properties window, making sure I've got the film details form selected, and scroll down to the position category. So there we go, the startup position property. It's set to center owner by default, which means that the form appears in the middle of the Excel window. The other settings there are things like center screen, which will appear in the center of the screen, obviously. So regardless of where the Excel window sits on your screen, the form will appear in the middle of the entire screen, not the Excel window. There's Windows default, which will use whatever your Windows default settings are. But the interesting one here is the manual setting. This allows you to control exactly where the form appears on screen by setting the left and the top property. So I think I mentioned in the previous video, left represents the distance in points from the left-hand edge of the screen to the left-hand edge of the form, and top is the same from the top of the screen to the top of the form in points. So let's just change these manually. I'm going to set the left so that it's set to 200 and the top so it's set to something like 50. And then making sure I've got the manual startup position set, head back to the form and then run it again. So this time the form should appear exactly where I've chosen to position it, 50 points from the top and 200 points from the left. If you close the form down and then go back to that same section in the properties window, you may well find that some things have changed ever so slightly. So the left is set to 200.25 and the top is 50.25. Just accept that this happens. There's not a lot you can do about this. Because the measurement units you're using here are in points, and the form is positioned on screen based in pixels, there's often a slight little adjustment to those settings. As I say, just accept it. There's not much you can do about it. I'm going to set the startup position of my form back to center owner, the default setting, and then I'm going to talk about a slightly better way to get your forms to run from an end user perspective. You certainly don't want your end users to have to come into the VB editor and choose to run the form. So we're going to end up with either a button or a keyboard shortcut the user can press to make the form appear. So before we do that, I'm going to write a quick subroutine that's going to load the form into memory and then show it on screen. So to do that, let's insert a module into the VBA project, just as we would ordinarily if you right-click on any item in the VB project and choose Insert Module. I'm not going to bother renaming the module at this point. We're only going to have one module in the entire project for the time being, so it's fine called Module 1. What we are going to do is have a quick subroutine here, which is going to be called Display Film Details Form, something along those lines. Okay, so there are two things that happen. In order to make the form appear on screen, it has to be loaded into memory, and then it has to be shown. You can actually achieve both actions in one single step simply by doing this. If I want to refer to my form, it's called film details, so I can use its code name. If I press Control Space on the keyboard to display the IntelliSense, and I start typing in the name of my form, film details, it will appear with the class symbol listed next to it. So if I say film details dot show, so the show method will make it appear on screen. If the form was not already loaded into memory, the show method would implicitly do that, so I don't have to explicitly load the form. You may find that you want to do that explicitly before you show it on screen. So should you want to do that, you can use the load method of VBA. So if I again use the IntelliSense, press Control Space and look for the load method or the load function. If I type in a space after that, it tells you that it requires an object as an object, very helpfully. What it wants to know is the name of a form that you want to load into memory. So again, I'm going to refer to my film details form. If I press Control Space again, look for film details and enter that. So as I say, this load method isn't technically necessary to make the form appear on screen. You can just do that by saying film details.show. It's sometimes useful to load a form into memory so that you can access some of its properties. So you might want to set default values for some of its controls or change some of its design in some way. So you can do that while the form is hidden from view and then finally show the form on screen with the show method. So it's entirely up to you. Just to make sure that this actually works, all we're going to do is run this subroutine in the same way we ordinarily would. So click somewhere inside the subroutine and then click the little green triangle or press F5 on the keyboard, and we ought to see that the form runs just as though I'd done it myself manually from the VB editor. So I'm going to close the form down and then look at how we can attach that subroutine to a button that the user can click on. So to draw this button, let's head back into Excel. And then from there, let's insert a new worksheet that's going to act as our menu sheet for this little system. So I'm going to click the Add Sheet button, or of course you can press Shift and F11 or any other way you know how to insert a sheet. Let's rename the sheet so it's called Menu, so we know what we're going to add to this one. And then we can draw a button using the Developer tab in the ribbon. There's an Insert tool which has a bunch of different controls we can draw on the background of a worksheet. Just for now we're going to stick with the basic form controls. So the top left hand corner option there, the basic button tool. If I click on that once, I can then either click and drag or just click once with the mouse to draw a button on the form. On the worksheet even, sorry. When you do this with the form controls button, it's going to ask you which subroutine, which macro it says you want to attach to the click event of the button. So if I choose the only one that we've written, display film details form, and then click OK, this button now will allow me to launch the form when I click on it. Just before I do that, I'm going to edit the text on that button. So I'm going to change it so it says something like, I don't know, show form. Let's make it fairly quick and simple and obvious. To activate the button, then I need to click away from it, and then if I hover the mouse back over the button, you'll see the mouse cursor changes to the little finger pointy cursor, and if I click on that, it will indeed trigger that subroutine that we've written, which will show the form. If you need to select the button to make any changes to it, the awkward thing now of course is that clicking on the button will actually trigger the code. So to select the button, probably the simplest thing to do is just right click on it. That will display a context menu, but you can see in the background it's also selected. So I can then just click on the button again. If I want to edit the text, I can do that. If I want to resize it or move it around, I can do that as well. To activate the button again, just click away from it, and then clicking the button the next time will launch the code again. One small issue with these boring little command buttons is that there's very little you can do in terms of formatting them. If I right click to select it again, I can format it in terms of formatting its font colour and so on, but the background colour is fixed, this boring old grey background. I can change a few other basic things about the font alignment and so on, but it's fairly limited in terms of what you can actually do in formatting terms. So if you want something a bit more elaborate, I'm just going to cancel this dialog box. You can achieve a similar result by drawing or inserting any sort of drawing object on a background of a form and attaching a subroutine to it. So at this point I'm going to go back to the Insert tab in the ribbon, and on the Insert tab I'm going to look for the Shapes option. My toolbar's quite, my ribbon's been quite compressed here, running through a fairly narrow screen, so you'll find the Shapes tool might be a little bit more expanded on your own particular ribbon. If I click on the drop down arrow there, you'll see the standard auto shapes, and you can draw genuinely any of these shapes you like on the background of the worksheet. So let's have a smiley face. If we click and drag to draw one of those, you won't be asked immediately do you want to assign a macro to it, but you can right click on the object after you've drawn it and then choose to assign a macro. So if you do that, you'll get the exact same list of macros we saw previously, subroutines we've written. So we've got display film details form, select that one and click OK. While you're here, if you like, you can make any modifications to its fill color and its fancy shape effects. If you want these fancy 3D effects and glows and all these sorts of things, anything you want to do, you can format that shape in any way you like. Then if you click away from the tool and then click back on it, you'll find it has exactly the same effect as the original fairly boring grey brick looking button we had previously. There is one final type of control you can draw on a worksheet which allows you to attach code to it. It works slightly differently to the basic form controls and the auto shapes we've drawn so far. So to draw one, head back to the Developer tab in the ribbon and go back to the original Insert tool. So earlier on we used a form controls button, which is just called a button. If you look in the bottom half of this list, you'll see a separate section called ActiveX controls. Now, not only do these sound more exciting, ActiveX, but they've also got a lot more things you can do with them. They have lots more events than just a simple click. So there's lots of replication here. We've got buttons in the form controls, I've got command buttons in ActiveX controls, I've got combo boxes in both and check boxes in both. The command button though works a lot more like the buttons you draw on the form in the VBA editor. So rather than just being able to click on this, there's several other events that I can use. To draw one, you draw one in exactly the same way as a form controls button, so I can click on the tool and then either click once or click and drag on the worksheet to draw this button. I can resize it and move it around. You'll see that, of course, it hasn't asked me which macro I want to attach to it yet, and that's because that's not how these ActiveX controls work. ActiveX buttons are all about properties and events. So if you want to modify anything about this button, what you can do is look at the properties window while you're in Excel. You may notice that as well that on the Developer tab you've gone into what's called Design Mode. You see the Design Mode button is active. That means that I can click away from the button and then click back on it to select it without triggering any code attached to it. Later on, when we have written some code in the button, we can come out of Design Mode by clicking on the tool and then click on the button to actually trigger the code. So for now we'll stick in Design Mode so that we can select the button without trying to trigger any code, and then we're going to view the Properties window just by clicking the Properties button on the Developer tab of the ribbon. So the Properties window is essentially the same Properties window you see in the VB editor. So you can change all the same sorts of properties as we saw when we were designing the form in the previous video. So for the button I want to change two things. First of all, its name. Let's call this Show Film Details Form. Make it nice and descriptive. And then we'll change its caption as well, so that it says something more sensible as well. So the caption property up at the top in the appearance section, let's say just show form, same as we did for the form controls button earlier on. Anything else you want to change, like its background colour and its fore colour, you've got a lot more choice in terms of formatting this button than you had the basic button earlier on. So feel free to change those as you like. For now I'm just going to close down the properties window, and the next job is actually to attach some code to this button so that it does something when it's clicked. There are several ways to view the code behind the button, so you can see that when you've got it selected you can click the View Code button on the ribbon. I could also choose to right click on the button and choose to view its code. I could also choose to view the code behind the worksheet and then choose the settings manually. So if I right click on the Menu Sheet tab and choose View Code, that would also allow me to view the code behind any object sitting on it. But by far and away the simplest way to view the code behind the button is just to double click on it. So if I were to do that, I'll be taken straight back to the Visual Basic editor. I'm looking at the code view of a specific worksheet. That's the menu sheet that we inserted earlier on, and I'm looking at a specific event procedure, so a private subroutine that will be triggered on the click of my Show Film Details Form button. I can use the drop-down list at the top of the window. If you watched the previous video on events as part of the main Excel VBA tutorial, you'll be familiar with how these work. So any objects that sit on the form that have events, that sit on the sheet that have events, I can select from the drop-down list. And then any events of the object that I've selected, I can choose from the drop-down list at the top right-hand corner. So you can see for an ActiveX button there's many more events than just clicking on them. I can make something happen when I double click, I can make something happen when I move the mouse cursor over the button, when I press the mouse button down, when I let the mouse button go back up, and so on and so on. So there's a lot more sort of granularity in terms of how you can control these. For now we're going to stick with a basic click event. So all I'm going to do in here, I could do a couple of things. I could call the procedure that I wrote in the module earlier on. So I could say something like call, sorry, not call by name, but rather than call, what do I call it? Display film details form. So that would call the procedure I've written previously. Alternatively, I could just write out the same code again. So I could say load film details form, and then film details dot show. entirely your choice here with how you want to make this code work. I think I'll stick with this as I've taken the time to write out these two separate instructions. We'll load it into memory and then show it on screen. One last quick thing before we head back to Excel, you may notice that having displayed the properties window in Excel itself, it's still in our properties window from the Visual Basic Editor. If you want to bring it back, you can head to the View menu and choose Properties, or just click F4 or press F4 on your keyboard, but that will display it again in the VB Editor. Really annoying that. I don't know a way to stop it from happening either, so just bear in mind that you can bring it back. Anyway, back into Excel. Let's see if this button actually works. We'll need to head out of design mode first, so let's click on the design mode button to exit design mode, and then if we click on the show form button now, it will once again show our form on screen, just as the previous two objects we drew. So we have a nice simple way for the user to launch the form and display it on screen. What we want to do now is talk about what you can do to navigate through the form when it's loaded. So you notice when you first run a form, there'll be one control that's active, or control that has the focus, as it's called. So you can see in this case it's the Add to List button. It's got this sort of dotted outline around it. You can change the control that has the focus simply by clicking on a different control, of course. But you can also use the keyboard to do this. If I press the Tab key on the keyboard, that will navigate to the next control, which in this case happens to be the Cancel button. If I press Shift and Tab, it will go back to the previous control. If I carried on pressing the Tab key, it will cycle through all the controls on the form one by one until it gets back to the first one, and then continues through the list in the same order. If I press Shift and Tab, it will do the same thing in reverse. So what if you wanted to control exactly what controls were tabbed to and what order that happened in? I think it might make a bit more sense when the form first loads to have the title text box as the first control. So let's close the form down and head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then let's see what we can do about changing the tab order. The basic property that controls the tab order of items on the form is called tab index. So each control on the form has a number which represents its position in the order. If I select my Add to List button and then scroll down to the Miscellaneous category inside the Properties window, and look at the tab index property, it's set to 0. So it's a 0-based index, so the number 0 represents the first item. If I look to the Cancel button, that's got the tab index 1. If I look at the frame, that's got a tab index of 2. So it goes to the Add to List button first, then the Cancel button, then to the frame. Now inside the frame, each control has got its own tab index. So if I look at my title label first, I can see its tab index is 0. Then the gross label is index 1, and the release date is 2, and the text box is 3, and so on and so on and so on. So how can you modify that? What I ideally want to do is make the frame appear above the Add to List button and the Cancel button in the tab order. So to do that, I'm going to click on the background of the form. Then I'm going to go to the View menu at the top of the screen and choose Tab Order. This is much better than modifying the individual tab index numbers in the Properties window. I could do it that way. I could manually enter numbers to control the tab position, but oh my goodness, that would be so tedious. So using this dialog box is much easier. If I select my Film Details frame, I can choose to move it up in the order by clicking the Move Up button a couple of times, then click OK. Then if I run my form, I should be able to see now this time that the title text box gets the focus first, and I can hit the tab key to navigate through the text boxes, and then it will go to the Add to List button, and then the Cancel button, and then wrap around back to the title text box again. So using the tab order to control the order of items on the form makes life much easier for the end user. They're in the first text box to begin with. All they need to do is start typing. Now if you wanted to control the tab order of controls inside the frame, you can do that too. Let's imagine, for instance, that you wanted the user to enter the release date before the film gross. You might want to then move the release date text box and label above the gross, and then you wanted to change the tab order so that it went title, release date, and then gross. I'm not actually going to move that. I'm quite happy with the order that they're in already. But should I want to move the tab order of controls inside the frame, what I can do is this. If I click into a text box first, so select a control that's inside the frame, then just head back to the same menu option, View Tab Order. And you'll see this time you're looking at the list of controls inside the frame rather than at the top form level. So I can see that I've got my text boxes sitting towards the bottom after all the labels. You notice we didn't actually tab to the labels because, well, you can't. The labels are just descriptive text which appear on the form. So you can't tab to those anyway, so it will tab through the individual text boxes. There is a reason for the labels being here, by the way, which we'll explain very shortly. But for now, I'm just going to click the OK button. I'm not going to actually make any changes to the tab order. It's probably also just very quickly worth mentioning that you can remove controls from the tab order should you want to. So for example, let's say we didn't want to tab to the cancel button and accidentally risk selecting that one. So if I select my cancel button in the design view, I can go back to the miscellaneous category and then find the tab stop property. So it's set to true by default. If I change that so it's set to false, that means it will the tab key will no longer stop at the cancel button. So the simple effect of that, if I run the form again, I'll find if I hit the tab key, I'll cycle through the text boxes to the Add to List button, but now if I hit the tab key again, it's going to skip over the cancel button and wrap around again up to the title text box. So that's how you can remove controls from the tab order. I'm just going to go back to the design view and I'm going to re-include my cancel button in the tab order by setting that tab stop property back to true, just in case you should need to do that for certain controls. Another way to navigate around a form quickly using the keyboard is to assign what are called accelerator keys to the different controls. You may have seen these used in existing Microsoft dialog boxes. Often you'll find this as an option with an underlined letter in it, and pressing the Alt key and that letter will go to that option. So let's assign accelerator keys to the Add to List and Cancel buttons. If I go to my Add to List button first, and then look in the miscellaneous category down here, there's an accelerator property, and all I have to do here is type in any letter that exists in the caption of that control. So it's the caption that controls how this works. If I type in a letter A, that will underline, when I press enter or click away from that, it will underline the letter A in the Add to List caption. If I typed in the letter X there, then nothing would happen at all. There'd be no indicator that that was the accelerator key. So let's type in a letter A. It doesn't matter if it's uppercase or lowercase either, by the way. It's not case sensitive, this property. So there's the accelerator key for the Add to List button. For the Cancel button, I think it makes sense that it's the letter C. Now here it does make a difference if I type in an uppercase or a lowercase c, because I have both upper and lowercase c's in that cancel button's caption. So I typed in a lowercase c here, I'll underline the lowercase c in the caption. If I typed in an uppercase c, it'll underline the uppercase c. It doesn't affect the actual keyboard shortcut you use. It would still be holding down the Alt key and then pressing C. That would still activate the accelerator. It's quite possible as well to assign the same accelerator key to multiple different controls. I could happily assign A to the cancel button as well, and that would underline the letter A there. What would happen when the form is running is if I press Alt and A once, it would go to the first control based on the tab index that has an A accelerator key, so it would go to the Add to List button first, then pressing Alt A again would go to the cancel button, Alt A again would go to Add to List, and so on and so on and so on. So let's just go back and set this back to a capital letter C to make it look nice, and then what we'll do is go to run the form, and what we should be able to see is if I press the Alt key and A, you should see that the Add to List button receives the focus, and there it is. That would have the same effect in the real world as well, as clicking on that button. So had I attached any code to the button's click event, it would run any code for that button. If I press Alt and C, it will go to the cancel button, and then Alt and A again. You can press the same keyboard shortcut multiple times to trigger it multiple times, but there you go, accelerator keys. It can also be useful to assign accelerator keys to the various text boxes. The big problem with that, of course, is that a text box doesn't have a caption property, so there's no way to indicate in the text box itself which key is the accelerator. And in fact, if I close down the form and then go back to the design view, select this text box, the text box doesn't actually have an accelerator property at all. You'll see in the miscellaneous category, that property is missing. So the way to make this work for text boxes is a little bit fiddly, but you can use a corresponding label, or technically any control that has a caption property. So traditionally that would be a label. If I go to the title label, I can assign an accelerator to this control, even though we know that we can't tab to labels. They're not part of the they're not items that you can tab to. They can't be activated. So I assign an accelerator key of T to the title label. What I then need to do is ensure that the very next control in the tab order is a text box which can be tabbed to. So if I make sure I've got an item in the frame selected, then I go to the view menu and choose tab order. Sorry, let's try that again. Let's select something that can be tabbed to in the first place. So I'll select the text box and then go to the view menu and choose tab order. What I wanted to make sure of is that the film name text box is immediately after the film name label in the tab order. So let's move that up a couple of steps. While I'm here, I'm going to do the same thing for the film gross, and then film date and film date label sit in the correct order there. So if I were to click OK now, and then run the form again, if I just make sure I've clicked somewhere else first of all, just make sure that this works, hold down the Alt key and press T, because I can't tab to the label, it will go to the very next control as long as that control can be tabbed to. So very quickly we can do the same thing for the gross and the release date. If I close down the form and go back to the design view, I can select the gross label and I can go to the miscellaneous category and let's assign a capital G to that. And then for the release date, let's assign a capital R to that. So once we've done all of that, we can run the form again, and now we can essentially navigate the thing just by using the keyboard. So I can press Alt and G to go to the gross, Alt and R to go to the release date, Alt and A to click the Add to List button, Alt and C for the Cancel button, and Alt and T to get back around to the title text box. So a really nice, efficient way to navigate a form. I guess the problem with these is making sure that your users know that they can do this. You may well find that your users simply aren't familiar with holding down the Alt key and pressing an accelerator, but a little bit of information to the end user, and they can navigate around the forms really quickly. So there are two more keyboard shortcuts just to quickly look at to wrap up this video on form navigation. And these are keyboard shortcuts associated with command buttons on your form. So whenever you have a command button, you can set that button to be either the default or the cancel button for the form. The effect of these is if I set a button to be the default button, then if the user presses the enter key, it will have the effect of clicking that button. If I set a cancel button, hitting the escape key on the keyboard will have the effect of clicking that button. So a fairly obvious choice for a cancel button here will be the cancel button on our form. And the default button I think we're going to set up to be our add to list button. So if I select my add to list button and then look into the properties window, look for the behavior section, there's a default and a cancel property. So I'm going to set the default to be true. I can do that either by clicking on the drop down arrow or just double clicking will cycle through the various options here. And then if I do the same thing for the cancel button, I'll click on the cancel button and set its cancel property to true. It's quite possible for one button to be both the default and the cancel button, or that'd be slightly odd. So I can set the cancel button to be the cancel button true and the default button true. You can't have more than one button on a form being a default button or more than one button being a cancel button. So you'll see if I switch back to the add to list button now, it's automatically deselected the default property there. It's set back to false. So I'm going to set the add to list button back to true. So the simple effect of that is if I run the form, if I press my enter key on the keyboard, you'll see that it will have the effect of clicking the add to list button. If I hit the escape key on the keyboard, that will have the effect of clicking the cancel button. One thing to watch out for with the default button, if I have any control that is not a command button selected, pressing enter will indeed click the add to list button. But if I had my cancel button active, if I press enter now, enter will have the effect of clicking the active button, the one that has the focus. So just watch out for that slightly unusual behaviour. If you have a command button with the focus, pressing enter will click that command button, not the default. Okay, so that kind of wraps up all the different techniques for running and navigating through forms. Hopefully that was useful. The next video in the series is going to talk about how to make this form actually work by starting to add some code to it. So join us next time for that one. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseL website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.